Most people imagine the war in the Pacific as a story told in explosions and waves. They picture carriers rolling with aircraft, jungle hills lit by artillery, and destroyers trading fire under a night sky. In that memory, metal screams, guns bark, and the sea is full of silhouettes. Hidden behind that noise, another struggle was taking place, quieter but just as decisive, fought not with salvos and charges but with survey stakes, blueprints, and the steady roar of engines pushing Earth aside. By the beginning of 1942, American leaders understood that they faced an ocean that could not be crossed by courage alone. Ships and aircraft needed places to land, refuel, and repair. Troops needed depots, warehouses, and hospitals. Yet many of the islands scattered across the Pacific were little more than strips of sand and coral with a few wooden huts and rough footpaths. Before the war, civilian contractors had begun building airfields and docks for the Navy, but once enemy planes and ships started to strike without warning, sending civilian crews into the front lines became too dangerous to continue. The answer was a new kind of unit. The Navy gathered workers from mines, sawmills, road projects, and construction sites across the United States and turned them into naval construction battalions, soon known by everyone as the Seabees. They were older than many frontline troops, often skilled men in their 30s and 40s who had spent years mastering trades. They knew how to pour concrete, run explosives, weld steel, and, most importantly, operate the heavy machines that had transformed building work back home. They were told that they would build under fire if necessary and defend themselves when the fighting came close. Along with rifles and hard helmets came the machines that would quietly reshape the battlefield. American industry shipped out bulldozers, scrapers, graders, and cranes in growing numbers. These crawlers rolled on steel tracks, pushing steel blades that could slice into jungle soil and coral. Within hours they could level ground that would have taken gangs of unassisted workers days of backbreaking labor with shovels and picks. In contrast, the Japanese Empire relied far more on manual labor and simple tools. Its forces could compel thousands of men to dig and carry, but without mechanized support their progress stayed slow and fragile. On distant islands, that difference did not feel like a statistic. It looked like a brown wall of jungle in the morning and a clear line of churned earth by evening. It sounded like diesel engines running without pause while sweat burned in the eyes of the men on the seats. It meant that a muddy trail could become a road wide enough for trucks before an enemy patrol could fully understand what was happening beyond the trees. Each time a bulldozer rolled down from a ship ramp onto hot sand, it carried with it the possibility that this empty, exposed shore could soon become a working base. The Seabees landed almost shoulder to shoulder with combat troops. On Guadalcanal and elsewhere in the Solomons, they worked under air raids and shell bursts to lengthen and repair airstrips so that American fighters and bombers could keep flying. They filled craters, cut drainage ditches, and laid down pierced steel planking to turn soft soil into hard runway. At times they dropped their tools to take up rifles, then climbed back onto machines as soon as the shooting eased. Their days blurred into a cycle of building and defending, with little separation between the two roles. Photographs from the time rarely captured that constant effort. Official images favored pilots leaning against their aircraft or officers studying maps in a tent. The men on bulldozers usually appeared in the background, covered in dust more than glory. Yet commanders watched their progress closely. When a new airfield opened sooner than expected or a harbor became usable in record time, reports moved up the chain. The pattern repeated itself across island after island, from early footholds in the South Pacific toward the central chains that guarded the enemy homeland. Admiral William Halsey, who oversaw major operations in that vast theater, eventually gave his own simple measure of what mattered most. When he later described the tools that had brought victory in the Pacific, he ranked submarines first, radar second, aircraft third, and bulldozers right behind them. Coming from a man who had lived his career on the bridges of warships, that admission revealed just how powerful those quiet machines had become in his eyes. They allowed bases to rise out of wilderness faster than the enemy could tear them down or bypass them. By the time the first Seabees finished one project, their orders were often already sending them forward to the next bare island, the next stretch of coral, the next strip of sand that had to be turned into a functioning strongpoint. Engines were loaded, Blades were checked, fuel drums were stacked, and the cycle began again, each move carrying them a little closer to the heart of the enemy and to the battles where their unusual kind of strength would be tested to the limit. By the time the island fighting reached the Solomons and beyond, the idea of bulldozers as quiet helpers in the background was already fading. On some shores they were among the first things officers asked for when the planning started. They were not just tools for later. They were part of the landing itself, in the same way that artillery and landing craft were part of it. That truth became painfully clear on a small group of islands whose names many people would later forget, even as they carried airfields and depots that pushed the war forward. The Treasury Islands did not look like a place where history would turn. On a map they were small shapes between the bigger battles already burned into memory, part of the slow push-up through the Solomons. To the men who approached them by sea in 1943, they looked like another ring of trees and beaches hiding unknown defenses. Somewhere behind those green walls were enemy positions, and beyond those positions lay the ground that had to hold supply dumps, roads, and runways. The only way to clear that ground was to take it, and then to tear it open with steel and sweat until it could serve as a base. The landing brought the usual chaos of surf and fear. Boats scraped bottom, men stumbled through the water, and someone always slipped or dropped something vital into the sea. Shell bursts churned the sand and branches, and no one could be sure which shape in the tree line was a stump and which was a gun. In that noise and confusion, heavy equipment seemed almost out of place. Yet as soon as a foothold existed, the same question always came up. Where could the bulldozers be brought ashore, and how fast could they start moving? On these islands, one of the machines that rolled down from a ramp belonged to a naval construction battalion manned by workers turned sailors, the Seabees. The bulldozer was a big crawler, a caterpillar model that men simply called a D8, its steel blade already scarred from other jobs. At its controls was a seaman named Aurelio Tassone, not a famous figure, not someone who had ever expected that his skill with heavy machinery would earn decorations. He was one of many who had grown up in a world where moving earth for a living was an ordinary trade. When the unit came under fire, the bulldozer stopped being just a construction asset. The loose sand and rough ground were clogged with debris, damaged vehicles, and hastily thrown up defenses. Some of that cover protected the attackers. Other obstacles trapped them in narrow spaces where enemy fire could find them easily. A regular truck could not force a new route. Men on foot could not shift wreckage quickly enough. A machine that could push aside earth and metal suddenly had more value than most people had ever imagined in a firefight. Tassone drove his crawler into that space where construction and combat overlapped. With the engine revving and the blade up, the machine became a moving wall that drew attention and fire. It was loud and obvious, a target that could not crawl behind a log or hug the ground. Yet the same noise and size that made it vulnerable also made it useful. It forced open paths, crushed light barriers, and shoved wreckage out of the way. Behind it, men could move with a little more cover than bare sand and thin bushes could provide. Every meter he advanced meant staying at the controls while rounds snapped through leaves or spat against the blade. The crawler shook over roots and craters, and each jolt threatened to throw him from the seat or slam his body against the hard surfaces around him. Still, the blade kept moving, slicing into small earthworks, breaking the edges of foxholes, and flattening positions that had been carefully prepared. The machine that had been meant to cut runways now hacked channels through the front line itself. It was a strange kind of courage, different from the image of a soldier charging forward with a rifle. There was no chance to duck behind a tree or lie flat for a moment. The operator was tied to his engine, forced to remain upright and exposed enough to work the controls. Yet the effect of his actions rippled outward. Positions that had been safe for the defenders suddenly became open ground. Covered routes that attackers needed appeared where none had existed. What had been a solid line turned into broken fragments that no longer supported each other. Bit by bit, the Seabees and infantry pushed deeper, helped by the lanes that the bulldozer carved as stubbornly as any sapper with explosives. Behind them, the beach began to change too. Once the worst of the immediate fire was suppressed, the same machine that had just been a shield and battering ram turned back to its more familiar job. It cleared space for dumps of ammunition and fuel, scraped level stretches for tents and medical posts, and started the early work that would lead to full airstrips and roads. Tasson's determination under fire did not go unnoticed. For his actions on the Treasury Islands on that day in late October, he received the Silver Star, an award that marked him out among his peers. It was an official recognition that driving a bulldozer in the middle of a fight could be as brave and as important as manning a gun mount. On paper, it was one line among many in the long record of the campaign. In reality, it captured a shift in how the war itself was being fought. What happened there was not an isolated incident. Across the Pacific, similar stories played out in different forms. Bulldozers dragged damaged landing craft out of the way so fresh ones could reach the shore. They built berms that shielded fuel tanks from shrapnel. They cut emergency taxiways so aircraft could keep operating from cratered fields. Each story had its own details and its own quiet heroes, but together they added up to something larger. They showed that the power to move Earth quickly and fearlessly could change the tempo of battle. As the work on the Treasury Islands continued, the outlines of new facilities began to emerge from the rough ground. Survey stakes marked lines where future runways would run. Piles of coral waited to be crushed and compacted. Roads started to snake inland from the beaches toward chosen sites for depots and batteries. The first day's terror gave way to a different kind of rush, the race to build faster than the war could destroy, a race that the Allies were increasingly equipped and trained to win. By late 1943, the pattern of the war in the Pacific had become clearer. Allied fleets moved forward from island to island, never taking more ground than they could support, always searching for places where air power could be based a little closer to the enemy. Each new landing was more than a battle for sand and trees. It was a race to see whether construction crews could turn raw ground into working airfields before the enemy could regroup and strike back in force. Nowhere was this race more obvious than on small, low coral atolls that seemed at first glance almost useless. Many had little fresh water, thin soil, and no real ports. Yet they had one decisive feature. Their flat stretches of coral and sand could be turned into runways that fighters and bombers could use. Once that happened, the whole shape of the surrounding sea changed. A place that had barely supported a few fishing huts suddenly became a launch point for raids, convoys, and reconnaissance. The Seabees, those construction sailors with their bulldozers, graders, and cranes, were at the heart of that transformation. Long before each operation, planners in distant rooms pored over aerial photographs and maps, tracing lines where future runways might run and marking where fuel tanks, ammunition magazines, and maintenance shops should go. On the ground, those abstract lines became wooden stakes, rough marker flags, and shouted instructions. Bulldozers began to scrape off the loose top layer and cut down small rises, working in long straight passes that took shape as the bones of airstrips. The pace at which they worked grew more aggressive as experience and confidence mounted. On one atoll, Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, the need for speed was brutally clear. The landing there was costly, the beaches narrow and defended, the tide treacherous. Bodies and wreckage littered the shoreline by the time the ground was finally secured. Yet almost as soon as the worst of the fighting ended, engines were running inland. The coral surface that had broken tracks and caught feet during the assault now became the raw material for construction. Bulldozers and scrapers chewed into the white ground, pushing and leveling. Coral was crushed and compacted, watered and rolled again and again until it hardened into a surface strong enough to take the weight of fully loaded aircraft. Seabees worked through heat, exhaustion, and the smell of spent explosives. They were guided by engineers who knew that every hour counted, that long delays would give the enemy time to send bombers and ships from other bases to strike this newly won foothold. What followed bordered on the unbelievable for those who watched it unfold. Within roughly 15 hours of the island being secured enough to work in relative safety, a captured Japanese airfield on Tarawa had been repaired and lengthened to the point where Allied aircraft could begin using it. A place that had been firing at the attackers in the morning was helping those attackers in the evening. The same ground that had been cratered and shredded by bombs and shells now held aircraft refueling for new missions. This was not magic. It was the result of preparation, mechanization, and a willingness to push men and machines to their limits. Equipment had been loaded onto transports in careful order so that critical bulldozers, graders, and compactors could be brought ashore quickly. Spare parts, fuel, and steel matting were stacked where they could be found without delay. Crews knew their tasks before the first ramp dropped. When the moment came, they moved almost automatically, each step of the process feeding the next. Similar scenes played out again as the campaign moved on to larger and more strategically important islands. Saipan, in the Marianas, was one of those places. It was bigger than many earlier targets and closer to the enemy homeland. Taking it meant bitter fighting across ridges, sugarcane fields, and urban areas. Once the ground was under Allied control, it also meant an urgent rush to build airfields capable of handling the heavy long-range bombers that would strike at the enemy's industrial heart. On Saipan, the Seabees faced not just coral but also rough volcanic soil and damaged existing facilities. They attacked the problem with the same relentless drive they had shown elsewhere. Bulldozers plowed through remaining debris. Engineers laid out wide strips that would become runways for the big bombers, and crews spread layers of fill, gravel, and paving material in precise sequences. In only 4 days of intense labor, the first major runway was ready for operation, and aircraft began to arrive. From the air, the change was dramatic. Pilots who had flown over those islands months earlier had seen mostly green and brown, a mix of jungle, fields, and scattered roads. Now they saw lines of pale coral and dark paving cutting across the landscape, rows of revetments protecting parked aircraft, and the shapes of hangars, fuel tanks, and workshops. Ships in the surrounding waters could look shoreward and see supply dumps rising, pipelines being laid, and vehicles moving along new roads that had not existed days before. These feats multiplied across the theater. By the time the war neared its end, the Seabees and other construction forces had built or improved more than 400 bases and over 100 airfields across the Pacific. Each one represented thousands of hours of planning, shipping, digging, lifting, and finishing. Each one allowed aircraft to fly farther and more often, ships to refuel and rearm more quickly, and ground forces to receive food, ammunition, and medical care in places that had been wilderness at the start of the conflict. On the ground, the men doing the work saw it more simply. They remembered the endless dust that coated skin and gear as bulldozers ground coral to powder. They remembered the stinging rainstorms that turned half-finished sites into slippery traps. They remembered working by the light of portable lamps, engines roaring through the night while the sky glowed faintly from distant fires. Sometimes enemy planes tried to disrupt their efforts, dropping bombs on survey stakes and half-laid steel matting. Sometimes shells reached in from offshore guns. Yet the pattern held. Damage was cleared, machines were restarted, and the work resumed. With every finished runway, the balance of the war tilted further. Aircraft that would once have stretched their range to the limit now flew from secure, well-supplied bases close to their targets. Fighters could escort bombers for longer stretches, reducing losses. Search planes could patrol wider areas of ocean, making it harder for enemy ships to move unseen. The bulldozers that traced the edges of these airfields had no glamorous profiles and no sleek wings, but without their work the air power above them would have been far less effective. As new bases came online, the older ones did not become useless. Instead, they joined a growing chain of support that reached back across the Pacific, each link connected by cargo ships, tankers, and troop transports. Supplies flowed along that chain, carried overseas that had once been contested but were now increasingly under Allied watch. At every major stop, the same familiar silhouettes could be seen in the distance, blades lowered, tracks grinding, lifting clouds of dust into the hot air. The more islands were turned into functioning airfields and ports, the more the shape of the whole campaign changed. Commanders gained options. They could choose new landing sites, plan routes that avoided enemy strongholds, and pressure multiple points at once. The enemy, facing this growing network of bases, had to spread its resources thinner and thinner. Somewhere beyond the horizon, yet another operation was already being prepared, with more stake markers, more blades, and more ground that would soon be forced to carry the weight of war. As the campaign rolled on from the Solomons toward the Central Pacific, the map on the wall in distant headquarters began to look less like scattered and more like a growing pattern. Each island taken and held was not just a victory sign. It was a node in a spreading web of runways, fuel tanks, workshops, and depots. The lines between them were shipping routes and flight paths, invisible roads laid over the water and through the air. At the heart of nearly every new node, somewhere behind the tents, guns, and signal masts, there was the unmistakable shape of a bulldozer blade catching the light. The men who ran those machines did not speak in grand terms about strategy. They felt it in simpler ways. They watched ship after ship arrive at a once empty anchorage, heavy with crates and drums, and knew that none of it would move far without roads and hard standings to carry the load. They saw pilots climb down from aircraft and walk across surfaces that had been bare dirt or coral not long before, and understood that those surfaces were the reason those aircraft could operate here at all. The quiet recognition that everything depended on ground being shaped fast enough never left them. Compared to the enemy, the imbalance in sheer mechanical power was striking. Japanese forces on many islands still leaned heavily on human muscle. Prisoners, conscripted laborers, and soldiers dug with shovels and picks, pushing loaded carts and carrying baskets. A work party could be counted in hundreds, sometimes thousands of men, yet all of them together might move less material in a day than one determined operator on a modern crawler. In rough terms, a single skilled bulldozer driver with a large machine could equal the output of a crowd of 300 manual laborers, taking on in hours what would otherwise drag out over weeks of effort. On the ground, that fact looked almost unreal. One man climbed into a steel seat, pressed the starter, and listened as the engine turned over and caught. He moved levers with hands that were already calloused from years of similar work back home, eased the machine into gear, and dropped the blade. Earth, coral, and roots gave way in front of him. A shallow rise vanished, a trench filled, a new path appeared. Behind him, clouds of dust rose and settled on parked trucks, crates, and helmets. Around him, a few men with tools followed to finish edges and mark grades, but the heavy lifting belonged to the crawler. The United States could afford to send these machines because its factories kept turning out more. Assembly lines that once produced tractors and construction equipment for farms and cities were now feeding the war effort. Crates marked with familiar brand names reached depots on the American West Coast, then moved by rail and ship into the Pacific. In time, whole units of Seabees found that they were as likely to be short on sleep as on equipment. If a machine broke, spare parts were often available. If a site needed more blades, planners tried to arrange it. The industrial engine far behind the front lines kept pushing them forward. For the men who had spent their lives in civilian construction, that continuity mattered. Many of them had operated similar bulldozers, scrapers, and cranes for years. They knew how far they could push a machine before the engine ran too hot, how to nurse worn tracks through one more night, how to improvise repairs when a key part failed in a place with no proper workshop. They used those skills in conditions far harsher than any building site at home. Jungle humidity rusted everything. Coral dust chewed into moving parts. Salt air crept into wiring and bearings. Yet the work pressed on, because stopping meant falling behind in the constant race for advantage. Life on these growing bases carried its own rhythm. Before dawn, engines coughed and roared to life as crews tried to use the slightly cooler hours for the hardest pushing and grading. By mid-morning, the heat pressed down like a weight, sweat soaking shirts and turning dirt to mud on skin. Dust clung to every surface, settling inside noses and throats. When tropical rainstorms arrived, they turned unfinished roads into slippery channels, flooding trenches and washing away markings. As soon as the water drained enough, blades were lowered again and the same stretches were reshaped. At night, lights winked across the half-built landscape. Portable generators powered string lights over key work areas. Bulldozers and graders moved by the glow, their engines a constant background to the quieter sounds of hammers, saws, and welding. Somewhere beyond the horizon, enemy pilots prepared to test these new installations with bombs and strafing runs. On some nights they found their way in, dropping explosives that tore gashes through fresh runways and shattered stacks of supplies. Each hit meant more work. Craters had to be filled, twisted metal dragged away, new surfaces compacted before dawn if possible. The growing number of bases brought new kinds of complexity too. It was no longer enough just to scrape out a runway and a few roads. Now each island might need multiple landing strips, each designed for different types of aircraft. Fuel storage had to be placed far enough from living areas and ammunition dumps to minimize the damage if something went wrong. Drainage systems had to be carved so that heavy tropical rains would not flood vital areas. All of this planning had to fit within whatever rough terrain the island offered, whether it was low coral, rolling hills, or volcanic rock. Through it all, the Seabees and other construction troops stayed close to the front edge of the war. They were seldom far from danger. On some islands, enemy troops still lurked in the hills or jungles while construction began near the shore. Occasional shots snapped out from unseen positions, and patrols went out daily to keep the work zones secure. In other places, artillery from nearby islands or from ships offshore probed for targets. A line of bulldozers cutting a new road or clearing a supply area made an inviting mark on any observer's map. Yet the results were impossible to ignore. Supply ships no longer had to idle offshore waiting for small craft to shuttle cargo slowly over open beaches. Instead, they could tie up to piers that took shape under swinging crane booms, unloading directly onto trucks that rolled along graded roads toward inland depots. Aircraft no longer had to operate at the edge of their range. They could take off from fresh runways, fight over distant seas or islands, then return with fuel to spare. Medics could move wounded men over smoother routes to field hospitals rather than jolting them along narrow jungle tracks. From a distance, it might have looked like a simple equation. More machines, more output, faster progress. Up close, everything depended on the stubborn persistence of individuals. An operator stayed on the seat long past the point where his muscles ached. A mechanic crawled under a hot engine to fix a problem so that the machine would be ready for the next shift. An engineer walked the site again and again, shifting lines and grades to get the most out of limited ground. Each effort was a small gamble against time, weather, and enemy action. As the web of roads across the ocean thickened, commanders began to think not just about the next island, but about the ones after that. The string of bases in the Solomons and Gilberts pointed toward the Marshalls. The Marshalls pointed toward the Marianas. Beyond those, future arrows on the map aimed toward places whose names already carried a heavy weight, places closer to the enemy homeland where the fighting would grow more intense and the need for fast construction would become even more demanding. By the time the Marianas and the Marshalls were in Allied hands, the map of the Pacific looked very different from the one that had existed at the start of the war. What had once been a scattering of isolated outposts had become a chain of strongpoints, each with its own airfields, fuel farms, and depots. Cargo ships moved between them with increasing confidence. Long-range bombers rose from new runways to strike targets that had been untouchable months earlier. Yet every arrow that crept closer to the enemy homeland brought a reminder that the hardest ground still lay ahead. The next operations would press into territories that the enemy had held for decades, places ringed with defenses and protected by distance and weather. Iwo Jima, a volcanic speck between the Marianas and the main islands, became one of those grim stepping stones. On a chart it looked small and simple, but for bomber crews flying from the Marianas it sat in a crucial position along their route. If it could be taken and turned into an air base, damaged aircraft would have somewhere to land on the way home instead of falling into the sea. That promise alone justified the terrible cost of taking it. When Marines fought their way ashore on Iwo Jima, they met black sand that swallowed boots and tracks alike. The volcanic ash shifted and slid underfoot, dragging at every step. Even as the battle raged over the ridges and caves, construction units began to look at that unstable surface not just as an obstacle but as raw material. Bulldozers clanked up from landing craft and began to nose into the ash, blades pushing dark waves aside. The operators had to fight not just the terrain but also the constant risk of fire from positions that had not yet been silenced. Working behind the front lines, Seabees and other construction crews clawed out and improved airstrips under relentless pressure. The ash refused to pack easily, so they mixed it with other materials, layered it, and compacted it again and again. They knew that every hour mattered. Somewhere above them, bombers were already flying missions from the Marianas, and some of those bombers would soon be looking for a place to come down short of home. Within weeks, runways on Iwo Jima were ready enough for the first emergency landings. Crippled aircraft that might have vanished into the ocean instead rolled to a halt on those hard-won strips, their crews stepping out onto ground that heavy machinery had forced into usefulness. Farther west, even larger plans were taking shape. Okinawa, a sizable island south of the main enemy homeland, became the next major objective. It offered room for multiple airfields and bases that could support operations directly against the home islands. At the same time, everyone understood that capturing it would trigger fierce resistance. The approach to Okinawa meant sailing into waters prowled by submarines and aircraft, including pilots who had begun to carry out deliberate suicide attacks against ships. The closer the fleet drew, the more important it became that any foothold gained on shore be turned into a working strongpoint with extraordinary speed. When troops finally landed on Okinawa, they found a landscape of villages, fields, ridges, and beaches. Some areas were taken quickly, others only after bitter fighting. As before, construction units moved in almost as soon as any ground was secure enough to work. Bulldozers churned through sugarcane fields and rough tracks, cutting broad strips that would become runways at places like Kadena and Yantan. They tore down old structures, filled in low spots, and pushed away debris from exploded buildings and vehicles. The sound of their engines blended with the distant thunder of artillery and the sudden roar of air attacks on the fleet offshore. The pressure was relentless. Enemy aircraft struck at ships in the surrounding waters, and each hit meant more casualties and more wounded who would soon need evacuation and care. Building airfields was not just about launching raids. It was also about bringing in transport aircraft, fighters, and medical planes that could move men and supplies quickly. Construction teams worked with the knowledge that every day lost meant more strain on the fleet and the troops holding the line. They pushed machines and bodies into long shifts, snatching sleep when they could under tarps or in hastily thrown-up shelters. All along the advance, other bases played their quieter roles. At Ulithi, a once sleepy atoll had been turned into an enormous floating harbor. Seabees had cut channels, built piers, and erected repair facilities on the low islands. Around them, dozens of warships and auxiliaries rode at anchor, forming a temporary city of steel and wake lines. Repairs that might once have required a return to distant home ports could now be carried out much closer to the front. Fuel, ammunition, and food moved out from that anchorage to keep the whole offensive moving. Without the earlier groundwork done there and at many similar sites, the final drive toward the enemy homeland would have stalled. By this stage of the war, the scale of what had been built was staggering. The Seabees and other engineering units had constructed or improved more than 400 bases and over 100 airfields across the Pacific. On some islands that meant a single strip and a handful of sheds. On others it meant networks of runways, taxiways, revetments, and warehouses. The men on the machines saw only their own corner of this effort most days. They woke, worked a section of road or strip, dealt with breakdowns and weather, and fell asleep knowing that another stretch would be waiting at dawn. Yet the effect of their work stretched far beyond any one shoreline. Heavy bombers now flew from the Marianas with escorts and navigation support that had been unthinkable earlier. Patrol aircraft hunted submarines from newly built bases, making the sea lanes safer for transports. Fighters took off from captured strips on Iwo Jima and Okinawa to shield fleets and ground forces closer to the enemy homeland. Each mission depended on fuel pumped through pipes laid by construction crews, on bombs stored in magazines they had dug, on runways and roads they had compacted under tropical sun and rain. The closer the Allies came to the enemy heartland, the more intense the confrontation became. Air raids grew in frequency and scale. Naval battles flared and faded along the approaches. Ground fighting on Okinawa dragged on, chewing through units and equipment. Through it all, bulldozer blades kept moving, sometimes inches at a time as operators eased around wreckage or worked on slopes that seemed barely stable. The machines had no armor beyond their thick steel and no weapons beyond the weight of their frames, but their presence on a piece of ground usually meant that the balance there was starting to tilt. Even after major objectives were declared secure, the work did not stop. Airfields had to be extended for heavier traffic. Additional hard standings were needed for more aircraft. New hospitals, fuel storage, and command centers had to rise to handle an ever thicker flow of men and material. Each day added another layer of complexity to these once simple islands. Each new layer rested on decisions made with survey stakes and the rumble of engines. Somewhere in the background, planners were already tracing lines on yet another map, thinking about what would be required if the war pushed one step further, and what role the men with machines would have to play in that next demanding leap. As the front edge of the war pushed closer to the enemy homeland, the headlines talked about famous battles, new aircraft, and daring raids. Reports named islands, squadrons, and ships, turning them into symbols of progress. Beneath those dramatic stories ran a quieter current of figures and schedules that rarely made it into the papers. That hidden layer was where engineers, logisticians, and construction officers measured the war in tons of coral moved, kilometers of road laid, and hours needed to turn bare ground into an operational base. On paper, some of those figures looked almost unreal. Trials and field experience showed that a single skilled bulldozer operator on a big crawler could move as much material in a shift as hundreds of manual laborers working with shovels and hand carts. It was not a perfect comparison, but it captured something important. On many islands, the enemy still relied heavily on forced labor and soldier work parties, lines of men walking under loads or digging trenches by hand. They could build strong defensive positions, but changing the shape of a whole island to support large air forces and fleets was far harder without massive mechanization. American planners read those numbers, then matched them against production figures at home. Factories that had once turned out tractors for farms and equipment for road crews were now assembling long lines of crawlers, graders, and scrapers. Train cars loaded with machine parts crossed the continent to ports. There, cranes lifted the boxed machines into cargo holds bound for the Pacific. Every shipment meant that somewhere months later another unit of Seabees or Army engineers would have enough blades and engines to attack a coastline or plateau and turn it into infrastructure. The effect of this effort could be felt in the way new operations were planned. When staff officers sat around tables covered in maps, they no longer thought only in terms of infantry and artillery. They asked how many bulldozers could be landed on the first day, how much steel matting could be put ashore in the first tide, and how quickly roads could be cut inland to safe ground. Some plans were altered because a small beach or narrow reef would bottleneck heavy equipment. Others were chosen precisely because a strip of flat coral or open grassland offered an ideal surface for rapid runway construction. On the islands themselves, these calculations turned into long strings of decisions and compromises. A survey team might find that the best ground for an airfield was also within range of enemy guns on a nearby hill. Commanders then had to decide whether to clear the hill first or accept the risk and start building under fire. In other places, the only feasible runway line cut across old village land or burial grounds, stirring uneasy feelings even in the midst of war. The bulldozers came anyway, blades scraping away the surface layer of history to lay down a new one measured in tire marks and blast shelters. The men on the machines just saw a queue of jobs. First, clear a beach exit so trucks could roll off the landing craft. Then cut a temporary road inland. Then level an area for fuel drums and a hospital. After that, begin scraping out the outline of an airstrip according to the stakes and flags the engineers had driven into the soil. Each task had to be finished fast enough that the next one could start without delay. They ate quickly when someone brought food, wiped sweat and dust from their eyes, and checked gauges that told them how hard they were pushing their engines. Higher up the chain, officers watched the pace of this work as closely as they tracked ammunition and casualty figures. A base that came online ahead of schedule could support raids that caught the enemy unprepared. One that lagged risked leaving ships and troops exposed without air cover or fast resupply. When a report arrived that a runway had been made operational in mere hours after an island was secured, or that a major airfield had been built in only a handful of days, it traveled quickly through headquarters. Those stories became proof that the strategy of combining firepower with rapid construction was paying off. Admiral William Halsey, who had watched much of the Pacific campaign unfold from the command level, drew his own blunt conclusion. When he later listed the tools that had brought victory in that ocean, he put submarines first, radar second, aircraft third, and bulldozers fourth. It was an unusual ranking for a career naval officer whose life had been spent on warships. Yet it fit the reality he had seen. Submarines had strangled shipping. Radar had sharpened eyes and reactions. Aircraft had carried the fight far over the horizon. Bulldozers had made sure those aircraft and ships had places to operate from, repair and resupply. For the men in dusty helmets who climbed onto those machines every day, such praise was distant and abstract. Their world was closer and rougher, measured in how many passes it took to level a section, whether a leaking line could be patched with what they had on hand, or how much coral dust they could breathe before their throats closed up. They knew the war was moving in their favor, because each new job seemed a little farther across the map, but they also knew that a single storm, air raid, or supply delay could suddenly make weeks of work fragile again. There was also the constant strain of working in spaces that never felt entirely safe. On some airfields, warning sirens would sound with little notice, sending crews scrambling for cover while engines still idled. Bombs might tear new holes in runways that had just been smoothed and compacted. Shrapnel could rip into parked machines, draining oil onto the ground and shattering parts that could not be replaced quickly. Then, as soon as the danger passed, teams would drag debris aside, count their remaining working machines, and start the process of repair and rebuilding. Even when enemy attacks missed their targets, the pressure did not let up. Schedules demanded that a runway be lengthened by a certain date so that heavier aircraft could use it. Road networks had to reach newly chosen artillery positions before the guns arrived. Harbors had to be dredged and piers strengthened in time to handle larger waves of ships. Each promise made in a planning room rested on the assumption that the Seabees and other engineers could hold the line against weather, mechanical failure, and enemy action long enough to deliver. As the months passed, the accumulation of these successes built a kind of momentum of its own. Bases that had been rushed into existence with minimal facilities were gradually expanded, their runways extended, their storage areas widened, their repair shops upgraded. At the same time, new islands were being prepared closer and closer to the enemy mainland. Supply lines thickened along the routes between them, making it easier to send fuel, parts, and reinforcements forward. From afar it looked like an inevitable tide. From the ground it felt like a never-ending series of individual pushes, each one just difficult enough that failure always seemed uncomfortably possible. Behind the famous photographs of bombers lifting off toward distant cities, or fleets steaming in tight formation toward contested coasts, there were always those other images less often captured. A bulldozer blade rising against a sunrise over torn earth. A mechanic standing waist-deep in a greasy hole under a stalled engine. An engineer squinting at a clipboard by lantern light, adjusting grades to account for unexpected soft ground. Together, these small scenes formed the quiet framework that held up the louder story of the Pacific War, even as no one knew exactly how many more islands, airfields, and harbors would have to be carved out before the fighting finally stopped. By 1945, the noise of the Pacific War had reached a pitch no one could ignore. Cities burned under bombing raids. Fleets clashed in vast arcs of ocean. Radio messages crossed thousands of kilometers every hour, carrying orders, reports, and casualty lists. Yet beneath that storm of events ran a steadier rhythm, the grind of tracks, the thud of blades biting into earth, the hammering of construction crews who had been at work since the first nervous landings years earlier. From the Marianas, long-range bombers now leapt toward the enemy homeland, their wings heavy with fuel and explosives. They took off from runways that had once been cane fields and scrub surfaces crushed, graded, and compacted by Seabees and other engineers. Navigation stations, service bays, and fuel storage rose along the edges of those fields, all of it anchored in ground that bulldozers had flattened and drained. Each mission, no matter how dramatic in the air, began with a slow roll over concrete and coral shaped by heavy machinery. Down along the island chains, the web of bases built in earlier campaigns continued to pulse with life. At one point, more than 400 bases and over 100 airfields had been built or expanded across the Pacific. On some, the war had moved on, leaving behind quieter harbors and half-used facilities. On others, the tempo remained intense, with ships arriving daily, supplies stacked in neat rows, and aircraft coming and going in a constant rotation. The same bulldozers that had carved those places out of jungle and coral now helped maintain them, repairing storm damage, extending runways, and clearing space for yet more storage and housing. The difference between this mechanized network and the enemy's more limited infrastructure grew sharper with each passing month. The enemy still fought hard and skillfully, but its ability to replace lost ships, aircraft, and bases lagged behind. Where the Allies could reshape an island in days, the defenders often needed weeks of hard labor to build or repair major facilities. When a base was smashed by bombing or naval gunfire, they struggled to bring it back into full operation. For the side that could build faster than destruction, every loss was painful but rarely permanent. Inside the construction units, no one had the luxury of seeing the entire map at once. A CB on Okinawa worried more about whether the latest rainstorm would delay work on a taxiway than about grand strategy. A surveyor on an atoll concentrated on getting accurate levels through glare and heat haze. A mechanic in a makeshift workshop focused on coaxing one more hour of life from a worn engine. Yet all of their efforts fed into the same pattern. Every time a runway opened on schedule, every time a road reached a new battery position in time for a planned operation, the larger war tilted a little further in their favor. In the final months, the demand for speed only increased. New plans called for even greater concentrations of air power, more ships in staging areas, more troops in forward bases ready for whatever would come next. That required more fuel, more ammunition, more food, and more medical capacity. Storage areas spread outward from original cores, creeping up hillsides and along shorelines. Bulldozers leveled fresh ground for warehouses and tank farms. Roads thickened into networks, some stretches resurfaced again and again as traffic wore them down. All the while, the threat never disappeared. On Okinawa, airfields came under repeated attack as enemy pilots tried to shatter the platforms from which Allied aircraft rose. Bombs tore craters into runways that had taken days of effort to perfect. Fire scorched supply dumps and rolled through areas of light construction. Yet almost as soon as the smoke cleared, the work resumed. Craters were marked, filled, and compacted. Damaged steel matting was ripped up and replaced. Machines that could still move were pressed into service, even if their frames groaned and their engines ran rough. In quieter moments, some of the men who ran those machines looked around and recognized how far they had come from their pre-war lives. A bulldozer operator who had once cut suburban roads or leveled farmland now found himself carving through volcanic ash on Iwo Jima or sugarcane fields on Okinawa. A carpenter who had framed houses in small towns now helped erect control towers and maintenance hangars under the glare of tropical sun and searchlights. Their tools were familiar, but the scale and stakes of their work had altered beyond anything they had imagined. The industrial engine behind them, back in the United States and in Allied factories elsewhere, kept feeding the front with more. Even as some equipment wore out beyond repair, new shipments arrived with fresher machines. Replacement bulldozers came off cargo ships with paint still bright under the sea salt. Crates of spare parts allowed workshops to bring crippled units back into service. Fuel lines, pumps, and electrical gear followed in their wake. The ability to maintain a broad network of bases and routes depended on this constant flow of material as much as on the courage of those at the controls.